Choose a well-lit and controlled environment with plenty of table space. This is a good place to work. It has good lighting, plenty of clear, usable table space, and electrical outlets easily available. Now for the needed tools. For any solder setup, there's a pretty standard set of tools. We'll start with a soldering iron. You absolutely have to have a soldering iron, and there are many different types available. I like the station with the plug-in temperature-controlled tips that you can easily change. We'll talk about that in a moment. Once your soldering iron is in place, let's get in some sort of circuit board holder. Anytime you work on something, you have to have the ability to have it supported in a manner that it won't move around while you're working on it. You'll also need solder and flux. Solder is obvious, but flux isn't so obvious if you're just a beginner. It helps to clean and bind to the metal that you're trying to join. Hand tools are next. Everybody needs hand tools, and many sets can be got pretty cheaply at large discount stores, and some are quite similar to the ones used by jewelry makers. A solder removal tool is a necessity because if you're making solder joints, you also have to take them apart sometimes. You also are going to need a multimeter. Many times you have to measure voltages, currents, resistances, and other values that you can't get any other way. There are many types of multimeters, but we'll cover that in another video. Let's talk about soldering irons. As I stated, the station type that you can set on a table and it has a changeable tip for temperature control is my favorite. This is a Weller model that I've used forever. It has a holder on the side for the iron with a wet sponge for cleaning the tip, and it also has tips that have various shapes for the type of work you're doing. You'll notice this is a chisel tip, which is useful for heating components that take quite a bit of heat to get the solder joint to join. You'll also see a number stamped on the base. This 6 indicates that it works at 600 degrees Fahrenheit. On the body of the iron itself, the barrel has a shield that unscrews with a thing like a nut. By removing the barrel, you can also pull out the tip. This needle-type tip has an 800-degree rating, as you see by the 8 stamped on the base. This is for working rapidly on small components and getting out before the heat can destroy it. You can change the tips easily, replace the shield, and screw the nut into place to hold it in for operation. But what if you don't have a temperature control on your soldering iron? That's easily remedied. The $5 ones or the cheap ones that are usually about 35 watts or so almost never have a heat control. So this is what I suggest. I've taken a standard lamp dimmer and installed it in an electrical box. And instead of wiring an outlet for a lamp, I've wired it for my soldering iron. Now I can set the heat to any temperature I want very easily and repeatably. Just to demonstrate its operation, I'll plug in a lamp so you can see it as it's normally intended to be used. Now, a soldering iron, unlike anything with a transformer in it, is not an inductive device, it's a resistive device. So it'll work just fine on a light dimmer, even like a small heating element would. Some soldering irons aren't suitable for electronic work on the workbench for, let's say, cable assembly or circuit boards. This is a standard Weller gun type or pistol type soldering iron. This is 100 to 140 watts depending on how deeply you squeeze the trigger. It clicks in 2 different positions. However, it's only good for really much larger devices, so you're not going to see this on the workbench very much. Now let's talk about hands-free devices or holders such as pan-devices. When you're working on a circuit board, you don't want to lay it on your workbench for a number of reasons. One, it's capable of tipping or moving around as you're operating, and that can really cause a lot of damage or frustration at the very least. Using a circuit board holding device allows you to mount the circuit board, turn it in any orientation, and reach any part of it very easily. This particular model is an older one, but it's also still readily available online. You can change the rotation, angle, and position of the board just as you wish, and then expose all of your connections directly to your soldering tip in just a moment. There also are other varieties of this that hold simple things such as connectors when you're fabricating cables or other assemblies, such as a standard pan device. These are available almost anywhere online. They don't cost a lot and they will save you a lot of frustration and effort. Let's get on to solder and flux. Solder obviously is necessary to make solder joints. But what type of solder do you use? I've got a collection of different types because of the many different jobs that I do with soldering, joining different alloys for different tasks. But for electronic work, for the most part, you want to use a 6337 mixture of solder. That alloy has the lowest melting point for lead and tin. Silver solder is often used for brazing, very hard or resistant joints that have to be made with copper, bronze, or other materials. Now flux, what's flux all about? Flux is an active chemical that bites into the surface of the metal and cleans it, removes oxidation and contamination, and allows the solder to dissolve the surface of the metal and wet it properly. Now lead-free solder can be a problem. It doesn't always work properly in electronic work, although it's intended originally for plumbing so that lead won't contaminate the drinking water supply. As mentioned earlier, the alloy of solder sets its melting point. Different materials can be used for solder, such as bismuth in some cases, but most alloys are mixtures of tin and other materials. Lead makes a very good additive to tin because it prevents the growth of tin whiskers, which can actually sort out and destroy circuitry. There are typically different types of flux. Liquid solder flux is usually rosin in a solvent base. An acid flux will eat into the metal very aggressively, but can cause problems when moisture is in the air later. Paste flux is a thicker type that can be stuck on and stay in any orientation of your circuit. Rosin core is similar. The solder itself is hollow and has the rosin inside, just like a straw. When you solder, it's automatically applied, but I usually keep a liquid flux on the bench at all times for working with bare wires as well. Common hand tools. As mentioned previously, many of the hand tools used in soldering are the same used by people who fabricate jewelry and specialty items. Diagonal cutters are probably one of the two most commonly used devices. These are used for cutting wires, snipping leads, and basically doing general cutting tasks. In some cases, you have to get right down to the circuit board and flush cut or trim directly to the surface. Flush cutters have an anvil that's designed to fit right against the circuit board and cut very cleanly. You'll generally need a pair of these if you're doing circuit board repair. Round nose pliers are sort of a specialty item. They're typically used in jewelry fabrication, but are also very useful when you need to form a wire into a half circle or more. Let's say to fit around a small round stud or connection point, or a post, or in some cases around a screw in a terminal strip. It's easy to change the diameter very quickly. These are often called needle nose pliers, but these are really snub nose pliers. Needle nose pliers have a longer nose. The anvils in these are capable of cutting wire very easily. A wire stripper is almost always needed. You don't want to scratch into the metal of your wire very much and cause it to fail. The screw on this one allows you to set the size of the hole so that the wire cannot be cut. The anvils for cutting the insulation will stop at a known distance. Many times you're going to want hemostats or forceps, locking scissor grips. These are old ones that I've had for quite a while and are extremely useful and can also act as a small heat sink when you're soldering things together. Tweezers are a necessity. Flat tweezers are great for picking and placing small surface mount components, and needle tweezers are also very good for working with tiny wires such as 30 to 40 gauge. Towel clamps are an unusual thing. They're used by surgeons to hold towels together over somebody when they're operating on them, but I use them to hold bundles of wire together during fabrication of cables. If you're making solder joints, you're going to need a solder vac or solder removal tool. This one has a spring-loaded plunger, and when the yellow button is pressed, the plunger sucks in rapidly, creating a small vacuum at the white Teflon tip. This literally vacuums liquid solder off of a solder joint to help clean it. Now, I have to admit, there's often been the urge to go to the front door with this thing on and go, "May I help you with something?" Just for the shock value. But a head magnifier can actually be a very useful tool on your electronic workbench. Many times there are small components that are very difficult to see. I don't know a lot of practitioners of electronics, after age 40 or 50 generally do need some magnification. There are many other tools that I could have included in this video, but for the most part, you're going to know what you need, and you'll know from practice. You learn the techniques and you learn what you need, and you go from there. So these are the requirements for setting up a professional electronics workbench, and I hope that you've learned something from this video. I'm Charles Schultz. Thank you for watching.